Okay, so last lesson we talked about factoring a quadratic. Now, I showed you two different types of quadratics, and one was when you have a trinomial and your this means there's a three-term polynomial. For example, let's say x squared minus 7x plus 10 equals 0. And I gave you the steps to solve for this. Step number 1, you had to get one side equal to 0, and then you have to find two numbers that multiply, because you have to factor this. Two numbers that multiply together to get this, and add together to get your middle term. And in this situation, you would take x in a negative 5, x in a negative 2. Because look, if I multiply x times x, I get x squared. X times negative 2 is negative 2x. Negative 5 times x is negative 5x. Negative 5 times negative 2 is positive 10. And then if I add these two middle terms together, I get negative 7x. X squared minus 7x plus 10. Look, see how it's the exact same equation. X squared minus 7x plus 10. So if I do this, I end up with the exact same equation. So when this is called factored form, this is called standard form, and technically they have the exact same value. So I haven't done anything with the values. Now, when I'm supposed to solve for this equals 0, I have to set this equal to 0. And once again, this is just review from last week. And I have to set this term equal to 0. I add 5 to get positive 5 as an answer. Add 2 to get positive 2 as an answer. So my two answers are 5 or 2. That means if I plug a 5 into here and do the math, I would get 0 as an answer. If I plug a 2 into this equation where the x is, substitute 2 for the x, I would get 0 as an answer. The other type of factoring we did last class was called a difference of squares. And if you remember from last week, let's take 100x squared minus 36. This can be factored whenever you have a minus sign and two perfect squares. It's called the difference of squares. And the way you factor it is you square root the first term, which is 10x and 10x. Square root the last term, which is a 6 and a 6. One's a plus and one's a minus. Now look, if I multiply this out the same way I did on the other equation, I would end up with this. And if you want to try to do it yourself, pause the video, go ahead and give it a shot. Anyways, I set this 10x plus 6 equal to 0. So I'd subtract 6 to get 10x equals negative 6. If I move this 6 over, divide everything by 10, and then reduce to get negative 3/5 as an answer, divided by 10. I'm just doing this fast. This is just basic isolating the variable. This reduces to negative 3/5. And then if I set this, 10x minus 6 equals 0, and solve, I would add both sides, so I get a positive and a negative 3/5 as an answer. Okay, there's something brand new today, and it's called the quadratic formula. You'll remember this formula, or probably not this exact formula, but you'll remember using this formula even when you guys get adults and somebody talks to you about algebra. You'll remember if somebody says quadratic formula, you remember you're going to say, oh, it's that weird long formula that we had to use. Probably won't remember what it's used for, but you'll still remember kind of using this. If you look at the notes that you should have printed up in front of you where it should be referring to, I give you three things, three example questions. First off is x squared minus 4x minus 32 equals 0. And I say factor. So I meant to write on the notes factor and solve. So if I were factoring this, I would take two numbers that multiply together to get negative 32, add together to get negative 4 is a positive 4 and a negative 8. If I set this equal to 0, I'm going to get negative 4 as an answer. If I set x minus 8 equals 0, I get positive 8. So I have negative 4 or 8 as a solution for that example question. The next example question I give you is the difference of squares. X squared minus 25. You factor this. This is x plus and x minus 5. So if I set this equal to 0, I'm going to get a negative 5. If I set this equal to 0, I'm going to get a positive 5. So my answer is plus and minus 5. Look at the very last one. 4x squared minus 3x minus 1. The question is factor this or solve for your x. Well, notice a difference between this trinomial. Let me erase some of this. And all the trinomials, the three-term polynomials that you've had so far. Two things when you factor. I've always given you questions where you can two numbers that multiply together to get this number, and the same two numbers add together to get this number, and there hasn't been any number in front of your x squared when it's been a trinomial. Now look at the difference with this. I have a number in front of my x squared, and there's no two numbers that multiply together to get negative 1, but those same two numbers add together to get negative 3. It's impossible because the only way you can get negative 1 is 1 times a negative 1. This is impossible, so you can't do it. You can't factor it. I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail in a few minutes. But the next thing I have on your notes is something called standard form. Standard form of a quadratic, and we're going to see this, not we, because I already know this, you're going to see this a lot next semester. Standard form of a quadratic is written as ax squared plus bx plus c. Now the reason why I have a, b, and c highlighted is because these are coefficients, or in basic English, they're numbers. So in an equation, like the last equation, I had 4x squared minus 3x plus 1. Notice your a is 4. Your b is a negative 3, and your c is a 1. These are numbers, and these are important with this specific quadratic formula. Okay, so I'm going to use a quadratic formula to factor. Now, the quadratic formula, when you look at the notes, it's a weird looking formula at the very end, and I'm going to explain when you use this. You use a quadratic formula when you cannot factor a trinomial or a binomial. You use it when you cannot factor it, and also when your a doesn't equal 1. In the last example, see how your a equaled 4? It wasn't 1, so we would use a quadratic formula. Now look, before I get started, I'm going to rewrite this one up here. 4x squared minus 3x minus 1 equals 0. I can't factor it, and my a doesn't equal 1, and I cannot factor this out. So therefore, that's the indication that you use a quadratic formula. Now before you get going, notice in the green in the notes, I say identify your a. There's my a. And I'm just going to get rid of this. Identify your b. This number in front of your x is your b. And I don't need my x. And this is my c. I'm going to plug everything back in a little bit, but I identified my a, my b, and my c. Now look at the formula. I'm going to put in blue everything that stays. Okay, notice I have a lot of stuff missing in the formula because on the notes, I have your A, B, and C in green. So you're going to replace it with the numbers. Let's start off with replacing everything in here with 4. If you look on the notes, this is negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times your a. I'm going to replace my a with a 4 times my c, all divided by 2 times my a. All right, now let's place all the numbers with b's. I'm going to plug a negative 3 into here. This is negative b plus and minus b squared, so negative 3. squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. I'm going to plug in my c for here. This is, if you look in the formula, this is 4 times your a times your c. Now you're asking, what the heck is this even used for? It's used to solve for your x. Normally you would factor it, set it equal to 0 and solve, but sometimes they're going to give you polynomials when you cannot factor it, but you need to still solve for your polynomial. So notice this has x equals this mess. Once you clean this up, that's what your answer is. That's why it says x equals. Now I would encourage you to do this in this order every single time. The very first is do everything outside of the square root. So simplify this. Negative 3 becomes positive 3. Simplify 2 times 4, which becomes 8. Okay, now simplify everything inside this parenthesis. 4 times 4 is 16 times negative 1 is negative 16. Now simplify everything inside here. So once again, simplify the outside, simplify the parentheses, simplify everything in here now. Negative 3 squared is 9. Because negative 3 times negative 3 is a positive 9. A negative and a negative makes a positive. Next step, simplify this and take the square root of it. 9 plus 16 is equal to 25. Now the square root, the square root of 25 is 5. If I went too fast for you guys, go ahead and rewind the video. That's what's great about watching a recorded lesson, because you can just rewind it where I lost you. Okay, now look. See how there's a plus and a minus here? This means two things. This means 3 plus 5 all divided by 8. 3 plus 5 all divided by 8. Or 3 minus 5. 3 minus 5 all divided by 8. That's what that plus and minus means. It means this plus this divided by this bottom number, your denominator. This minus this divided by your denominator. Anyways, 3 plus 5 is 8. Divided by 8 is 1. That's one answer. 3 minus 5 is equal to negative 2 over 8 is equal to negative 2/4, or if you did it on your calculator, negative 0.25. These are your two answers. That's called using the quadratic formula to find your x's. Let's try the second problem. Second problem. You should be able to look at this problem right here and say, okay, well, my a doesn't equal 1 right off the bat. 2x squared plus 10x plus 3. Your a doesn't equal 1. You can't factor this 2 out. Secondly, you can't find two numbers that multiply together to get 3 and add together to get 10. That's impossible. So this scenario is an indication of why you would use a quadratic equation. Okay, now look. First step, identify, look in the green in your notes. The very first thing that I say is identify your a. And I'm getting rid of my x's because for the sake of the formula, I just want to know my a, my b, and my c. Just want to know the numbers. Now I'm going to plug everything in. So I'm going to rewrite this equation. Negative b, I have x equals negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus parenthesis 4 times your a times your c. The whole equation, the whole thing, even this on the outside, divided by 2 times a. First step, wherever I have an a, I'm going to plug in a 2. Here and here. Don't simplify anything yet till you've plugged in everything. My next step, wherever I have a b, I'm going to plug in a 10. Here and here. And then lastly, wherever I have a c, I'm going to plug in 3. Now let's do it step by step, the same order that I did before. Simplify the outside of the parenthesis. See how there's a, or outside of the root. See how there's a negative 10 here? There's nothing you can simplify, so that just stays negative 10. And this is 2 times 2, which is 4. Okay. Simplify it inside the parenthesis. You don't have to go in this order, but there's so much room for error that normally if you don't go in this order, there's really a lot of ways to mess up. So I would just say do it in the same order every single time. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 3 is 24. Now, simplify left to right. 10 squared is 100. 100 minus 24 is equal to 76. All right. So here you are. What I'm going to do now, for the sake of making this an easy question, I'm going to take the square root of 76. Sometimes you'll get nice and easy square roots. Sometimes they won't be as easy. Anyways, the square root of 76, and I'm going to round to my 10th spot just to make it easy. So 8.7. So I have two answers. I have negative 10 plus 8.7, all divided by 4, and negative 10 minus, see how there's a plus and a minus? Negative 10 minus 8.7, all divided by 4. Okay. Negative 10 plus 8.7, divide that answer by 4, and I'm going to get some decimal of negative 0.325. And then for this, I'm going to get negative 18.7 divided by 4. It's going to give me negative 4.675. So those are my two answers. Sometimes you're going to have decimals. Sometimes they're going to work out nice and easy. Very last question now. I want you guys to, after I write this down, you have x squared minus x minus 6 equals 0. I want you to pause this video and solve using the quadratic formula. Now look, you can factor this. Two numbers that multiply together, you get negative 6 or negative 3 and positive 2. So it'd be x minus 3, x plus 2, and you could solve like that. But I want you to solve an easy equation like this using the quadratic formula because it's going to give you the same answer. Go ahead and pause the video and try it. Okay. Watch this. Before I do this, if I were to solve this a simple way, you would never use a quadratic formula if you can always factor. If I factored this, even though this wasn't what I'm asking you to do, it would be x minus 3, x plus 2, because negative 3 times 2 is negative 6, negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. Because there's an invisible 1 in here. There's an invisible 1 here as well. Giving me an answer of positive 3 and negative 2. So these are my answers, but I'm going to show you how you can get the exact same way using the quadratic formula, and you realistically would not use this formula if you can factor it, but it'll always give you the same answer. So I'm going to set this up, x equals, and I'm going to do it a little faster in this one. This is my A, this is my B, and this is my C. So x equals negative b, which is a negative 1, plus and minus the square root of b squared, so negative 1 squared, minus parentheses 4 times your a, which is 1, times your c, which is negative 6, all divided by 2 times my a, which is 1. All right. I'm just going to get rid of these numbers. I don't need these anymore. Now simplify, ignore this root and simplify outside. Negative and a negative 1 become a positive 1. 2 times 1 is 2. Simplify the parenthesis in here. 4 times 1 is 4, times negative 6 is negative 24. Simplify the root left to right. Negative 1 times negative 1, which is negative 1 squared. Negative 1 times negative 1 is a positive 1. 1, these two negatives become a positive. 1 plus 24 is equal to 25. And the square root of 25 is 5. Once again, if I lost you, just rewind this. It's a great thing, just rewind it. So I'm going to have, see this plus and minus? I'm going to get 1 plus 5, which is 6 divided by 2. See how it's equal to 3? And then 1 minus 5, which is negative 4, divided by 2. You see how that's equal to negative 2? Those are your two answers. So even if you factor it, you can always use a quadratic equation.